During its relatively brief history, the United States of America has grown from 13 colonies along the eastern seaboard into a great nation of 50 states. It spans North America and beyond. Building such a powerful nation required involvement with other countries. The founders of the U.S. built the government on a solid set of principles and freedoms. They believed citizens should have the freedoms to speak without fear of punishment, to practice any kind of religion without government interference, and to own property and to do business. The United States believes people all over the world deserve these same rights, but not every government agrees. Governments in many countries have denied their citizens even the most basic rights. This is called oppression. Strong governments have even claimed the right to conquer other nations. Throughout history, nations have competed for power and prestige by exploiting or taking complete control of the resources and people in weaker nations. The United States became a country by breaking free from an oppressive and stronger Great Britain. Because of this, the United States and its people tend to sympathize with countries facing threats from stronger nations. As America grew, it gained power and wealth, and with it, the ability to curb oppression. Does having the ability to interfere give America the right to do so? Is the United States helping others or acting in its own best interests? And does this involvement mean the needs of its own citizens will be neglected? These questions provoke a lot of controversy among Americans. Hi, I'm Bob Rue. In this program, we are going to examine the history of America's foreign policy. By the end of the program, you should have a better perspective about whether America should adopt a policy of isolationism or interventionism. Isolationists believe the United States should stay out of the politics of other nations. They see intervention as a way of forcing certain beliefs on others, which is a form of oppression. Isolationists also believe we have plenty of unanswered problems at home, and until those are taken care of, the United States has no business spending money on others' problems. Intervention costs America billions of dollars every year. Isolationists also argue that citizens have very little say about how that money is spent. Interventionists believe that people everywhere deserve basic freedoms. As a world power, the United States has a duty to maintain freedom throughout the world. They contend that the money spent on foreign aid is not entirely humanitarian. The U.S. economy benefits when more people, businesses, and countries are free to trade. Intervening, they believe, makes everybody happy. Both are strong arguments. So who's right? Well, American sentiment has changed several times throughout history. In its early days, America leaned towards isolationism. The first U.S. president, George Washington, advised his successors against intervention in his 1797 farewell speech.
The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is, in extending our commercial relations, to have with them as little political connection as possible. So far as we've already formed engagements, let them be fulfilled with perfect good faith. Here, let us stop.
Washington thought America should conduct business abroad and honor its promises, but stay out of other nations' politics. This sentiment was widely accepted, but not so easily followed. America had a lot of contact with other countries, as it was busy expanding its borders. Shortly after the United States purchased the Louisiana Territory from France in 1803, resentment surged against European presence in the Western Hemisphere. That resentment ignited revolutions in South America. Chile and Venezuela rebelled against their colonial ruler, Spain. In doing so, they sought recognition from the United States. Americans related to the desire of oppressed people for independence and pressured the U.S. government to become involved. President James Monroe responded in 1823 with the Monroe Doctrine.
The American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. We should consider any attempt on their part to extend their political system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety.
However, the U.S. did not apply the Monroe Doctrine to itself in dealing with Mexico. At this time, many Americans believed it was the United States' destiny to expand across the continent. This manifest destiny encouraged settlers to move into Mexican territory. Mexico lost the Texas territory to settlers. A decade later, they lost the Mexican-American War, and the United States paid Mexico $15 million for what is now the American Southwest. The Civil War ushered in a period of isolationism for the U.S. The devastating war lasted from 1861 to 1865 and consumed the souls and minds of Americans. After the war, the reconstruction of the South kept the attention of the U.S. leaders, leaving little time for foreign affairs. But the political pendulum was about to swing in the other direction. Just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, Cuban nationals waged guerrilla warfare to win freedom from Spanish colonial rule. The American press, trying to increase circulation, fed the public exaggerated stories of Spanish atrocities. Yellow journalism, as it was called, turned America once again towards interventionism. President McKinley wanted to remain isolated from the conflict, but faced pressure from many sides. Americans sympathized with the Cubans and were stirred up by a tabloid press. Members of Congress and the business community wanted to expand the United States' influence and territory. They were called expansionists. By entering the conflict against Spain, the United States had the potential to gain several Spanish-held territories. McKinley eventually gave in to the pressure and declared a short-lived war on Spain. When the smoke cleared, a few months later, Spain had lost the last remnants of its once great colonial empire. The United States emerged as a major world power with far-reaching colonial possessions. As part of the peace agreement, Spain freed Cuba and ceded the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico to the United States for $20 million. The Spanish-American War made a national hero out of Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt, and propelled him into the presidency 3 years later. As president, Roosevelt was a strong advocate of interventionism. His motto was, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." By that he meant that the government needed to use a threat of force to carry out its foreign policies. He used this policy in relating with Europe and Latin America. In 1902, European ships blockaded Venezuelan ports to force payment of debts. Roosevelt warned Europe that the U.S. would use force to defend Venezuela in accordance with the Monroe Doctrine. They withdrew, and Roosevelt helped Venezuela negotiate a settlement with several European nations. Roosevelt's interventionist policy in Panama would draw the most criticism. After Colombia refused the U.S. the right to build a canal across Panama, Roosevelt supported a revolutionary government that proclaimed Panama's independence. The Republic of Panama signed a treaty granting the U.S. control of the Panama Canal Zone, which meant control of shipping in the Western Hemisphere. In 1905, Roosevelt further expanded the U.S. role in Latin America by announcing the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. He reaffirmed that European powers should stay out of matters in the Western Hemisphere and that the United States should have the right to act as an international police power to keep them out. Over the next 20 years, the United States used the Roosevelt Corollary as justification for military force in Latin America. The United States Marines became known in the area as State Department troops because they were always moving in to protect American interests and policies in the Caribbean. This intervention generated resentment by people in the Caribbean and Central America that continues to influence attitudes today. Roosevelt's successor, William Howard Taft, attempted to quiet opposition from isolationists by announcing a policy of dollar diplomacy. The idea was to use trade and commerce rather than military force to increase the United States' diplomatic influence. Under Taft, the U.S. made loans to Nicaragua, Honduras, and other countries to encourage investments. In this way, he expanded U.S. business interests throughout Latin America and its influence in government affairs. Woodrow Wilson became president in 1913 and stayed the course of involvement in Latin America and the Caribbean. By this time, international affairs were becoming increasingly complex. Economies were growing more interdependent. At the start of World War I, Americans overwhelmingly opted to stay out of the European struggle. Many thought America could declare neutrality and go about its business. But the world had changed. Even though America was not being directly attacked, its overseas interests and business partners were. Wilson repeatedly negotiated for an end to the fighting and called on those involved to accept peace without victory. His re-election campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war," won Wilson another term in the White House. But Germany made neutrality very difficult. In In 1915, a German submarine sank a British passenger liner, the Lusitania, killing 128 U.S. citizens. This incident enraged Americans, but Wilson resisted joining the fight when Germany agreed to restrict submarine warfare in the Atlantic. Wilson worked for 2 more years to broker a peace agreement. However, in 1917, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking several American ships. France was facing imminent defeat, and Germany tried to instigate war between the United States and Mexico. On April 2, 1917, Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany. Neutrality had ended. The United States was caught up in the war to end all wars. As World War I ended, governments began to evaluate and openly criticize the old diplomacy. Wilson believed that world wars would continue as long as each nation was responsible for its own defense. He wanted the nations of the world to join together. A system of international arbitration and intervention was seen as the best means for preventing another global war. This would become the new diplomacy. The victors of World War I, Britain, France, Italy, Japan, and the United States, drew up plans for the League of Nations in 1919 with President Wilson as its chief architect. The League was established in January 1920 with headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland. The U.S. Senate differed with Wilson over the terms on which the United States would join the League. In March 1920, they rejected the Treaty of Versailles, which would have made the United States a member. American political sentiment had shifted towards isolationism again, seeing no need to be concerned with problems overseas. Warren G. Harding took office after the war, promising a return to normalcy. This policy of neutrality only held true for involvement in the Eastern Hemisphere. The U.S. continued to meddle in the affairs of Latin America, with troops stationed in Haiti, Panama, the Dominican Republic, and Nicaragua. U.S. investments, which measured more than $3.5 billion by 1928, tied the economies of those countries to America. While some Latin Americans appreciated their independence, others viewed U.S. involvement as opportunistic, just another form of oppression. In an attempt to address their resentment, Franklin Roosevelt announced a good neighbor policy in 1933, which promoted friendship and cooperation with countries in the American continents. During the 1930s, the world was struggling under an economic depression. Mired in its own problems, the United States government focused its efforts at home. But events were taking place around the world that would soon pull America out of its isolationist position. The global economic slump gave rise to extreme political movements in Italy and Germany. World War II began in Europe in 1939 when Nazi Germany invaded Poland. France, Great Britain, and other nations declared war against Germany. President Roosevelt maintained that America must become the arsenal of democracy, but not an active participant in the war. He pushed Congress to pass the Lend-Lease program. This provided essential war materials to Britain and her allies without directly involving the U.S. World War I was still fresh in the minds of many Americans. They did not want to become involved in another war in Europe. Several well-respected Americans, such as Charles Lindbergh, advocated isolationism. But on December 7, 1941, everything changed. That morning, Japanese planes bombed the U.S. military base at Pearl Harbor. The attack brought an immediate reaction of unprecedented unity from the American people. Families from every social class sent their sons and daughters to war. Women joined the industrial workforce. The effort to bring U.S. resources to bear upon the enemy touched nearly every American. The war ended as dramatically as it had begun. For years, Germany, Russia, Britain, America, and Japan had been trying to develop atomic weapons. On July 16, 1945, the United States successfully tested the world's first atomic bomb. President Truman authorized use of the new weapon to force Japan to surrender. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The destruction was unbelievable. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 14th. After World War II, America's relationship with the Soviet Union deteriorated. Though they had teamed up to defeat Nazi Germany, the two countries quickly became suspicious and hostile towards each other in the years following the war. Americans saw the Soviet Union's communist form of government and its efforts to spread communist revolutions around the world as a threat to democracy. The Soviet Union felt equally threatened by the United States' policy of containing communism. These tensions and the political games that followed became known as the Cold War. Russia detonated its own atomic bomb in 1949. England followed in 1952, France in 1960, and China in 1964. By the 60s, there was enough atomic weaponry to destroy the Earth many times over. The advent of intercontinental ballistic missiles meant the world was never more than a half an hour away from nuclear attack. Nuclear submarines could deliver their deadly cargo in a matter of minutes. The possibility of communist takeover or mass destruction made it nearly impossible for a major power such as the United States to remain isolationist. Both the United States and the Soviet Union understood that launching a nuclear strike would be suicidal. This duel has been described as two people standing waist-deep in gasoline, arguing over which had the most matches. An uneasy peace prevailed under a doctrine of mutual assured destruction. The specter of mass destruction motivated nations all over the world to work together. The peacekeeping efforts of the United Nations, initiated after World War II, had become more important than ever. Member nations united for peace, but still disagreed on major issues. America's foreign policy was based in large part on containing communism without engaging in direct combat with the world's two communist superpowers. This commitment to fight communism demanded an interventionist position. In 1950, under the authority of the United Nations, America sent troops to South Korea to stop the invasions by the communist North Koreans. 45,000 Americans lost their lives in that conflict. In 1962, the U.S. government discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. Missiles fired from Cuba could strike the eastern U.S. within minutes. The two superpowers came closer to full-scale nuclear war than at any other time in history. The standoff ended with the removal of Soviet missiles in Cuba and the U.S. removal of its missiles located in Turkey. During the Vietnam conflict, the United States intervened to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. However, many people were against the idea of the United States acting as a global police force. Thousands of Americans protested against the Vietnam War. College campuses often shut down as students turned out in mass demonstrations. The United States lost the war and nearly 60,000 American lives. With the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1989, the Cold War ended, and many thought the United States' justification for intervention ended with it. But national security issues and the global economy is keeping the U.S. from returning to any kind of real isolationism. Just in the last few years, the U.S. has intervened in Iraq's invasion of Kuwait during the Gulf War, as well as matters in Haiti, Somalia, and Bosnia. Most recently, the United States has retaliated against terrorist groups throughout the world. True isolation is virtually impossible today. Economies across the globe depend on one another to thrive and prosper. Groups like the World Trade Organization monitor international commerce. American political sentiment sways with the motivations for intervention, which include protecting economic interests, preserving democracy, and policing against major civil rights violations. Foreign policy becomes more complicated with the increase of international alliances. As a member, the United States is committed to protect fellow members of worldwide groups like the United Nations. And though the issues and circumstances may change, one thing will stay the same. People will always debate on when, where, and whether America should intervene.